A woman I'd never met sat down across from me at a coffee shop, a baby carrier balanced on the table between us, and asked me to pretend to be her daughter's father for one afternoon. I'd noticed her outside 20 minutes earlier, sitting alone on a bench, crying in the quiet, controlled way people cry when they're trying very hard not to draw attention to themselves. I'd asked if she was okay, mostly out of instinct, the kind of question you ask a stranger without expecting much of an answer. She'd looked up at me, wiped her face, and said, "Actually, I need a strange favor, and I understand if you say no." Then she asked me that. To come to her family's house that evening, to hold her daughter, to let her dying father believe, for one afternoon, that the little girl in that carrier had a father who loved her. I almost said no immediately, the way any reasonable person would to a stranger's bizarre request in a coffee shop. Something about the exhaustion in her face stopped me before the word came out. "Not without an explanation," I told her instead. I had no idea, sitting there with my coffee going cold, just how much more complicated the truth behind that request actually was. My name is David. I'm 34, an accountant at a mid-sized firm in Portland, divorced 2 years now, no kids of my own, living a life that, until that afternoon, mostly consisted of spreadsheets, a quiet apartment, and dinner with my brother's family most Sundays. I mention the divorce because I think it's part of why I didn't walk away from that coffee shop table the moment the request left her mouth. My ex-wife and I had wanted kids for years before things fell apart between us, and something about a woman clearly desperate enough to ask a total stranger this favor cut through my usual instinct to keep to myself. I lost my own father 8 years ago, slowly, over 18 months of illness, and I remember with painful clarity how much small, ordinary kindnesses from people meant during that stretch. A coworker who covered my shifts without being asked, a neighbor who mowed my parents' lawn every week without mentioning it once. I think some part of me recognized, in this stranger's request, an echo of that same kind of desperate love for a dying parent, even though I couldn't yet understand the specifics of what she was actually asking me to be part of. I want to be honest that I'm not a naturally trusting person. Years of managing other people's finances have made me cautious, someone who reads contracts twice and asks follow-up questions most people find exhausting. That caution is exactly why I told her I needed an explanation before agreeing to anything. What she told me next, sitting in that coffee shop with her daughter asleep between us, was enough to make me set my caution aside, at least for one evening. Her name was Rachel. Her father, Walter, was dying of pancreatic cancer, given weeks rather than months by his doctors. He'd never met his granddaughter's father, because the man, a brief relationship Rachel had entered during an especially lonely period after her mother's death, had disappeared almost entirely from her life the moment she told him she was pregnant, leaving no forwarding address, no explanation, nothing but silence. Rachel hadn't told her father the full truth about that disappearance. She'd let him believe, gently, that the relationship simply hadn't worked out, sparing him one more painful thing to carry in his final months. Now, with so little time left, her father had asked, more than once, gently but persistently, to finally meet the man Rachel loved, the father of his only grandchild. Rachel had run out of ways to keep delaying that request. I agreed to go with her that evening, on the condition that we kept the fiction simple. No elaborate backstory, no details that could unravel under questioning. Just presence, kindness, and enough warmth toward the baby to make her father's final wish feel granted, if not entirely true. The house, when we arrived, was smaller and more worn than I expected. A modest single-story home on the edge of town that Rachel told me her father had lived in for over 30 years. Walter was in a hospital bed set up in what used to be the living room, thin in the particular way illness thins a person, but his eyes were sharp, alert, clearly still very much present despite everything his body was going through. He studied me for a long moment when Rachel introduced me, longer than felt entirely comfortable, and I understood, watching him, that whatever fiction we'd agreed to keep simple was about to be tested by a man who had spent decades reading people for a living. A retired insurance investigator, Rachel had mentioned briefly on the drive over. The kind of detail I wished she'd told me before we walked through the door. The evening unfolded in careful, tense increments. Walter asked me questions I hadn't prepared for. How Rachel and I met, what I did for work, small details that I answered as honestly as I could without breaking the larger fiction, grateful, more than once, for years of professional habit that had trained me to think quickly under uncomfortable questioning. Rachel's aunt, Denise, who I gathered ran much of the household's day-to-day affairs during Walter's illness, watched me with an expression I couldn't quite read all evening, somewhere between curiosity and something sharper I didn't have a name for yet. At one point, while Rachel was in the kitchen warming a bottle, Denise asked me, quietly, how serious things were between Rachel and me, in a tone that felt less like small talk and more like she was gathering information for a purpose I didn't understand. Then it was a folder I noticed on the kitchen counter later that evening, when I went to refill my water glass, labeled Estate, Final Review, in handwriting I didn't recognize, sitting open just enough that I caught a glimpse of language about property division before Denise came in and closed it, a little too quickly, redirecting the conversation toward whether I wanted more coffee. Then it was a moment later in the evening when Walter asked to hold his granddaughter for a while, and I watched Rachel's face as her father's hands, thin and trembling, cradled the baby with a tenderness that made the whole fabricated evening feel suddenly much higher stakes than I'd braced myself for. Denise stood in the doorway during that moment, arms crossed, watching not the baby and not Walter, but me, with an intensity that felt entirely out of proportion to a stranger simply sitting in her brother's living room for an evening. None of these small details, on their own, felt significant enough to mention to Rachel that night, especially not while I was still focused on simply getting through an evening I'd agreed to on impulse. That was, I think, exactly the kind of evening where something larger could hide in plain sight, tucked between ordinary family tension and the genuine, aching sadness of a dying man meeting the person he believed loved his daughter. That folder on the counter wasn't the beginning of anything. It was just the first small crack in an evening that, the longer it went on, felt less and less like a simple favor between strangers. I drove Rachel and the baby home that night, both of us quiet in the particular way people are after performing something emotionally exhausting. Before I got out of the car, I mentioned the folder, carefully, not wanting to alarm her over something that might genuinely be nothing. Rachel went very still. She told me her father's estate had always been a source of quiet tension in the family, a modest but meaningful inheritance, mostly the house and a small life insurance policy, that Denise, as Walter's sister and the family's designated caretaker during his illness, had increasing control over as his condition worsened. Rachel admitted she'd been so consumed by her father's health and her daughter's needs that she hadn't paid close attention to the estate paperwork Denise had been managing, trusting her aunt's decades of family loyalty without much scrutiny. 2 days later, Rachel called me, her voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from her yet. She'd found, buried in a drawer of paperwork Denise had left out after a meeting with Walter's lawyer, a draft of an amended will dated just 3 weeks earlier that removed Rachel as primary beneficiary of the house entirely, redirecting it instead to Denise, with a clause citing Rachel's unstable living situation as a single mother with an absent father for her child as part of the stated reasoning. I remember reading that clause over her shoulder through the phone's photo she'd sent me. The specific phrase, unstable living situation as a single mother with an absent father for her child, landing with a particular cruelty, given that Rachel had constructed the entire fiction of that evening specifically to spare her father from ever having to think about that absence at all. Someone in her own family had apparently been counting on it quietly the whole time, as leverage. Rachel's own father's estate was being quietly restructured around the very absence she'd spent months trying to hide from him, using the fiction of that absence as leverage to justify cutting her out of the home she'd grown up in. I didn't tell Rachel to confront Denise immediately. Something in both of us went still instead of furious, understanding, almost at the same moment, that Walter's remaining time was too precious to spend on a chaotic family fight before we actually understood what we were dealing with. I used skills from my own work, the same careful documentation habits I applied to messy client finances, to help Rachel organize what she'd found. Dated copies of the draft will, notes on when Denise had scheduled her private meetings with Walter's lawyer, a timeline of exactly how quickly Denise's control over the estate paperwork had expanded once Walter's diagnosis turned terminal. During those same days, I found myself thinking often about how easily I could have simply driven Rachel home that first night and never thought about any of it again. The way most strangers who do a stranger a small favor eventually do. Something about Walter's hands around that baby, though, had made the whole situation feel like more than a favor I could walk away from cleanly. And I kept finding reasons to stay involved, telling myself it was just financial expertise I happened to have that might genuinely help, even as I suspected it was something closer to simple, stubborn care for people I'd only just met. I also spent an evening helping Rachel organize the timeline in a way that would actually hold up if it needed to, cross-referencing dates on Denise's calendar, which Rachel had access to as part of managing her father's care schedule, against the dates on the draft will's revision history. The pattern, once laid out clearly on paper, was hard to look at as anything other than deliberate. Rachel reached out to her father's actual attorney directly, a man named Harold, who'd handled Walter's affairs for over a decade, requesting, under the reasonable pretense of wanting to understand her father's wishes clearly during his final months, a full copy of the estate's current documentation. Harold, a little surprised by the request, given how much Denise typically handled these conversations, agreed to meet with Rachel privately. What Harold confirmed, gently but clearly, was that no final amended will had been signed yet, only drafted, and that his notes from recent meetings suggested Denise had been pushing hard for Walter to sign quickly, citing his declining health as reason for urgency, a framing Harold himself had grown quietly uneasy about over the past several weeks, without having concrete reason to act on that unease until now. I sat in on one of these conversations, at Rachel's request, mostly as a steady presence rather than any real authority in the room, though I found myself, more than once, asking Harold the kind of clarifying financial questions my job had trained into me almost reflexively. Harold mentioned something during that meeting that reframed everything for both of us. He said Denise had, years earlier, managed a similar situation involving their own mother's estate, back when Denise and Walter were much younger, a situation that had resulted in a permanent rift between Denise and a third sibling, an older brother neither Rachel nor I had ever heard mentioned in the family before. Rachel tracked down that estranged uncle through an old address Harold had on file, a man named Gerald, now living several states away, who agreed, cautiously, to speak with her over the phone once she explained the situation. Gerald described almost the exact same pattern Rachel was now living through. Denise managing their dying mother's care, quietly restructuring the estate's paperwork in the final months, citing exaggerated concerns about Gerald's unstable circumstances at the time, a difficult divorce he'd been going through, as justification for redirecting the bulk of their mother's modest estate to herself. By the time Gerald had understood what happened, the will was already signed, their mother already gone, and any legal challenge would have cost more than the inheritance itself was worth. What struck me hardest, listening to Rachel relay this story after the call, wasn't just the repetition of the scheme, though that alone was damning enough. It was the specific cruelty of the justification each time, using a family member's most painful, most vulnerable circumstance, a divorce, an absent partner, exactly the kind of thing a grieving or struggling person would already feel ashamed of, and turning it into the very evidence used to justify taking something from them, all while presenting herself, in every version of the story, as the responsible sibling, simply holding the family together. Denise hadn't improvised a plan in response to Walter's diagnosis. She had a proven method, refined once already at real cost to another sibling, and had simply adapted it again, using Rachel's private heartbreak as the newest version of the same convenient story. Rachel didn't confront Denise alone, and she didn't confront her with anger, not with so little of her father's time left to spend on conflict. She asked Harold to arrange a meeting with all of them present. Herself, Denise, and Walter, still lucid enough on his better days to understand exactly what was being laid in front of him. I wasn't in the room for that conversation, at Rachel's request, since my invented role in the family fiction had already served its purpose, and she wanted this particular truth to come from her alone. She told me afterward how it unfolded, Harold laying out the draft will, the timeline of Denise's meetings, and finally, gently, Gerald's story from decades earlier, which Rachel had gotten his permission to share. Denise tried denial at first, then a wounded explanation about protecting the family's stability, each version thinner than the last, as Walter, weak but entirely present, asked his sister directly whether what Rachel was describing about their own mother's estate all those years ago was true. Rachel told me her father's voice, when he finally spoke after Denise's long silence, was quieter and sadder than angry. A man simply grieving one more loss on top of everything else he was already losing. Walter signed a clear, unambiguous will 2 weeks later, with Harold present and Denise, at Walter's own request, no longer involved in managing any part of his affairs. He passed away peacefully about a month after that, with Rachel beside him, and, at Rachel's invitation, with me there too, in the strange, quiet role I'd stumbled into that first evening, and somehow never fully left. Rachel eventually told her father the truth about her daughter's actual father before he passed, gently, in her own time, and he received it with more grace than she'd expected, telling her that nothing about that truth changed how he felt about the little girl he'd gotten to hold in his final weeks. Denise's relationship with the rest of the family fractured further after everything came out, and as far as I know, she and Rachel haven't spoken since the will was finalized. Gerald, the estranged uncle, reconnected with Rachel afterward, the beginning of a relationship neither of them had expected to rebuild after so many years of silence neither of them had fully understood the reasons for until now. Not everything closed the way anyone might have wanted. Walter's final months were still marked by illness and loss no amount of resolved paperwork could soften. But he died knowing the truth, surrounded by people who loved him honestly, which mattered more to Rachel, she told me later, than anything the will itself could have protected. I still think, sometimes, about that first afternoon in the coffee shop, how close I came to simply saying no and finishing my coffee alone the way I'd planned to. Rachel has told me more than once that she wouldn't have blamed me if I had, that most people she could imagine asking that question would have. I've never quite known how to explain why I didn't, beyond the simple fact that something about her exhaustion that day looked like something I recognized from my own life, and I hadn't wanted to walk past it. Rachel and I still see each other, regularly now, in a friendship neither of us anticipated the day she sat down across from me with a baby carrier and an impossible request. What started as a single afternoon of pretending has become something real, still finding its own shape, built on the strange, honest foundation of having helped protect something worth protecting together. I think about how close Rachel came to losing her father's house and possibly his trust in her over a private heartbreak she never should have had to hide from him at all. None of it looked like a scheme while it was happening. It looked like a devoted sister stepping in to help during an impossible time. So I'll leave you with the question that's stayed with me since that first evening in Walter's living room. How much should the family we trust to protect us during our hardest moments actually be trusted before someone finally asks the harder questions? And if a stranger sat down across from you with an impossible request, would you have asked for an explanation too, or simply walked away?